And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 253. Today we're going to be talking about the notion of negative space in photography. Leave a comment, let me know you're here, tell me what the weather's like or what it's up to, and we can make a start. And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Yes, so negative space is what we're talking about today. Now, I've done podcasts before on the notion of negative space and minimalism. I will be touching on minimalism, but prior to this, when I've talked before about it, it's been primarily about minimalism. And this time I want to talk primarily about negative space. And the two do overlap, but this is really what we're going to explore today. Like I say, if you happen to be watching live, then leave a comment. Don't forget to like the video as well. That always helps with the YouTube algorithms. If you drag anybody else along if you can as well. If you're not watching live, you can still hit like as well, and subscribe and do all the rest of the bits. You can also leave comments as well. Now, that means they don't crop up in the live chat, but it does mean that if you've got something interesting to say or you want to make a comment on something, then do leave a comment. I should be informed sooner or later about it, and I can get back to you on that. And I think particularly in a topic such as this, negative space, where sometimes we think we've got an idea or we're not totally sure, then leave a comment, ask questions, or give a bit of feedback, or give your own insights into the topic as well, because anything that you write could be seen by other people and add an extra layer of interest to this podcast. So I can see we've got a couple of people in already. April says, greetings from a sunny Long Island, New York. Fiji says, good evening from Chennai in India. Janet joins us from a warm, overcast Mississauga in Canada, only going up to 27 degrees, followed by 3 days in the high, with highs in the low 20s. Oh, that's practically here. We're currently in the low 20s, I think 23 or something like that here in Castle Douglas. John says, hello all, I'm back from a 3-week absence finally. Welcome back, John. And April says, I hope it was for a good reason. Okay, bits of chat going on there. Now, the more eagle-eyed among you may have noticed a fraction of a difference in height. Well, basically, you might have noticed that the corner of the frame here of a bit of picture, which is normally just sort of sitting at the top, is actually halfway down the thing. And that's because today I'm standing up. This back of mine, just as I keep starting to think, oh, it's on the mend, then isn't. So I do actually have a standing desk, which I rarely tend to do, and it's one of these which you have to physically wind up, and about 100 turns and it comes at sort of stand-up level. And the last couple of days I've kind of woken up not feeling too bad, but then as soon as I've sat at the desk, the back's starting to play up again. So I've decided to have a go at doing standing. So that means I can kind of wiggle about a bit, hopefully stop my back seizing up so much. But it does mean that you might see me, wiggling about a bit more than I usually do. So don't be disturbed, just understand I'm standing at the standing desk. Yes, I can already see on the little bit of screen there that, so I'm going to be doing a lot of kind of twisting my hips and everything while I'm talking to you. Apologies if that's a distraction. Who knows, maybe next week I'll get back into the sitting down, or maybe this will become a permanent addition. Maybe we'll just need to stick a soundtrack on in the background and I can dance away, or maybe not. Right, okay, so let's have a little talk about this. So, quick bit update on Smug Points. So, the Smug Points for August. Yes, August, that's right, we're in August. Yeah. Smug points so far. Top of the leaderboard, we have Janet with 35 smug points, Eamon at 25 smug points, and VG is on 10 smug points. And everybody else is on 5 or 0, depending on whether you've turned up and left a live comment. So if you leave a live comment here as we're going out, then you get 5 smug points. So 5 smug points just for letting me know you're here. What could be easier? If you could stick an image in for one of our challenges, then you get 10 smug points. If you stick a picture in for critique and feedback, you get 25 smug points. And so consequently, basically, the more you contribute to these podcasts, the more smug points you accumulate. Now, if you get the most smug points in a month, you get to choose the next topic. And this is what Susan did. So Susan accumulated the most smug points for July. And she wanted to know a bit more about this notion of negative space. And so really, that's what we're going to be chatting about today. So let's make a start. So what is negative space? Well, I suppose really it's defined in opposition to the notion of the subject. So I tell you what, let's just pull up a subject and say that generally speaking, when we take a photo, what we're thinking about is the subject. In this case, a goose on Carling Walk Loch, which is at the bottom of Castle Douglas, the wee village wee town that I live in. And what I've done here is I wanted to focus on the goose, and I've angled it so you're not seeing the horizon, but you're just getting the water around it. And then it's also, the depth of field means that it's only focused where the goose is. And behind the goose is out of focus, and if we look even like just into the foreground, it's out of focus. So there's only a depth of field of roughly of probably about a foot and a half or something like that from where I'm standing with my zoom in lens. And what we've done then is, generally speaking, when we're photographing, we tend to think about the thing itself. Negative space is the bit that is not the thing we're photographing, or it's the bit which we're not noticing. Okay, now negative space, there's a sort of slight movement and fluctuation in exactly how it's defined, but it doesn't have to. You don't have to get too complicated on it. Generally speaking, think of negative space as the bit that's not the subject, but also is not adding to the subject, as in like echoes or another subject or something reinforcing, creating a relationship with the subject. Okay, so it's almost like if you were to sort of cut out and draw a line around it, if you inverted that line, that's your negative space. Now in a case like this, because we're focused on the goose, essentially the water becomes the negative space. Okay, so that's a kind of a loose idea. And then in the back, there's a little bit of like lilies or grass or some kind of greenery just growing or floating on the water there. And that sort of, it's sort of adding a little bit to the texture of the photo, but it's not really detracting from the photo. So we're kind of into the negative space. So what the thing is here really is we're talking about how the negative kind of starts to define the positive. Because there's two ways of thinking of this. When we think about it, we think about the object, but then the object only, or subject, it only really makes sense if you've got space around it which defines the subject. So that notion then that if you take a bagel or a polo mint which has a hole in the middle of it, the hole is part of the definition of the bagel or the polo mint. The outside gaps on the inside, these then help to define the shape, because without them we wouldn't see the shape. Okay, if you think back to the fill the frame concept that we talked before, where you don't have an outside, you essentially don't have that negative space, and it then doesn't always make it that easy to actually identify what it is you're actually looking at. As such, the fill the frame technique is quite a good way for going abstract or semi-abstract in your photography. But if you're wanting to be able to actually identify your subject, then you need to have space around it such that we can see it. And if the space is too busy, that can also interfere with being able to see the subject or make sense of the subject. Therefore, this sense of negative space isn't just some little weird genre on its own. It's actually kind of fully integrated into a large amount of photography in the everyday at a lesser level. However, what we're kind of concentrating on today is how that concept works with photography, but also with the idea of, I suppose we're pushing the idea of when you play, enter challenges. So practically everybody here either belongs to a camera club or on sites like PhotoCrowd, ViewBug, Guru Shots, anything like that. And what you have is you have titles, and negative space is one of these titles that will periodically crop up. So by getting a better understanding of this, hopefully it will allow you to put in more suitable images, or to go out and create more suitable images for this topic, and therefore hopefully score better. But keep asking me the questions as we go. I see Marilyn's joined us as well and says hello from a hot, sunny Colorado. Okay, so, I mean, in a way, I suppose negative space, a quick thing here, and I talked about this in previous podcasts as well, but there is a philosophical idea as well of existentialism. And in existentialism, there's the notion that the nothing defines the being. Okay, and maybe this is what it's about trying to make sure that you understand the concept here, that the example used by Sartre is Sartre goes to a cafe to meet his friend Pierre, and the absence of Pierre still defines his experience of the cafe. It's not about walking into a cafe and going table, chairs, waitress, till, decorations. He's expecting to find a friend there. When the friend isn't there, that's defining his experience of the cafe. But then you also take this idea, the larger idea, which depending on your religious ideas, if you don't believe in reincarnation or some kind of afterlife, then essentially life is bracketed by not life, life, not life. Okay, and it's the fact that there is a not life both before and after which actually defines life itself. So these are all parts of the philosophical concept of existentialism, but also feeds into this idea of negative space. It is the negative which really helps to define the positive, and in this case the water which is helping to define the goose. So let's take this idea then. If we could, let's sort of overlap it a little bit with, well, okay, let's just sort of show what happens. If we move out on this photo, and here we now have the goose with another goose, so we've got two geese, and we're onto the water, and we've got a background and reflections, we've got the sky reflecting it. Now what we've got is we've got space around the geese. Now if these geese were higher up or I was lower down, these geese might overlap the little bit of headland and the trees in the background. Okay, and those trees in the background would then interfere with our ability to clearly and quickly identify the geese. So that notion of having the space around them, and in this case around our reflections as well, is what helps to make it easy to understand what it is we're looking at. Now if we move out even further, go onto the wide angle lens, here now we can still see the geese, but the geese have pretty much become swamped by the rest of the space. So now in a way the subject isn't so much about the geese, the subject is more about the sky, the reflection of the sky, and then this bit of headland and its reflections is helping to give it shape, and these geese here are helping to sort of break up some of that space. Okay, so the geese are now playing second fiddle, if you like, to the larger picture. Okay, so negative space, you kind of start stretching out. At this point, it's not quite minimalism. Let's try something else for minimalism. If we want to talk about the idea of minimalism, then we have something like this. Now, same loch. In fact, right, see this little tree sticking out of the water here? It's like a little mini island in the loch. It says the same loch, so moved over. Here's that little bit of tree sticking out the water. So you can see the same loch. Entirely different conditions. I moved over. I've shot in black and white. It's foggy, right? Now, we have single swan, the reflection, virtually nothing else. Diagonally up, also on a kind of rule of thirds grid, we have the tree. And there's a lot of space around it. So here the negative space is really creating a sense of tranquility, of peace. But minimalism, why is this minimalist and this isn't really? This isn't really minimalist because it's quite busy. Minimalism is the idea, it can employ negative space, but minimalism is more of a concept. Minimalism is about the idea of how to minimalize, what can you strip away and yet still have the essence of the photo? Okay, what can you remove? It's almost a philosophy, it's a drive, it's an idea, it's a concept with minimalism. Rather than negative space, which is a physical thing you can draw around, minimalism is an ideal. And so what we're striving with minimalism is how much can we take away? How much space can we give it? How can we thin it down and yet still retain the essence of what we want. So it's a kind of decluttering idea, really. And fog, misty days are great for decluttering, minimizing the background and the amount that's going to kind of interfere with what it is we're trying to get across. So if what's April said? Oh, love the swan pic. Yeah, thanks, April. Here's another one where it becomes almost quite abstract. So here we've got two twigs sticking out of the loch, same loch. Foggy day, different foggy day. This one's in colour. But again, by not having the horizon in it, the water then there's not an obvious line, and then we've got the reflections. So I can zoom in here and we can see, little bit here where there's that little bit of water tension. It's just catching in the middle of the twigs, and then we've got, so this is a slightly submerged branch with some little bits of twiggy branch bits sticking up through the water, and they're reflecting. We're not seeing through the water, we're just seeing the reflections. And here then it's all about the space. So it's negative space. There's a lot of negative space in here, which is helping to define this. But also, because there's a lot more space, because we have stripped it down, we've got to a point where we're not worrying about other birds, we're not worrying about other plants, we're not worrying about ripples on the water. Then what we have is it becomes stripped back and quite minimalistic. Okay, so minimalism in this sense is employing the notion of negative space. What else have we got? Oh, Meg's joined us, says hello everyone, sorry she's late, and okay, a little bit of chat between VG and Meg. So where are we at next then? Okay, well let's I'll tell you what, let's try and expand this idea out and show you what happens when we take a subject and we really expand out the negative space in it. So here we've got a kite, red kite, and against the blue sky. Okay, so we've got the kite against the blue sky, and a bit like the goose, there's the negative space is helping to define it. Now, what I'm going to do is, if I open this with Photoshop for a moment, and just double check the image size on that. Yeah, that's okay. I made that smaller earlier. Now, in this case, what's happened? Actually, I'll just redefine this workspace, which I should have done earlier. Right, so you can hopefully still see the blurby stuff under here without my head blocking any of the important information. But what we have here is, so this is a square cropped image. Kite sits at a diagonal. This is all about the kite. The sky is just there to help define it. But let's say I put this on to, instead of background default, let's go to content aware fill. It makes sense. I like the curves of the wings. Yeah, they're cool birds, these ones. Right, so let's say then I just extend this out a bit. Maybe we give it a sort of slightly more landscape. Have it sort of sitting something at kind of something like that. And so essentially now what I've done is I've given it a bit more space. Okay, that sort of changes the feel of it. Let's go back to history. So from that to that, we're now creating more negative space around it, and it's giving it a sort of sense of being in a larger place. Okay, so the background, the environment is weighted more heavily than it was in the original crop. Now let's take it out a bit further. So let's expand it out, say something like that. And what we have now is this space is becoming even bigger. And now we are starting to move into this notion, getting closer to a notion of minimalism in some ways. Because when we were back at the beginning, you wouldn't call this a minimalist photo so much, because there's a lot of detail in the wings and the beak and the feathers and everything else. But by expanding out the crops, we are then making it smaller. Let's take it more. Okay, so now let's expand it out to here. See what that does. Now the bird is really kind of taking more of a backseat. This really is a kind of minimalist thing. And what we've got is just a tiny little bit of cloud there as well. A little bit of cloud, a little bit of bird, and nothing else but big blue sky. But there does come a point whereby it kind of then ends up becoming a little bit ridiculous. So we can make this bigger again. And okay, we're now making it so big it's taking time to really work. The program has to work its way through. Okay, this is now doing weird bits of interpretation with the colours. Don't worry too much about that. But what we can see here, though, is that the bird has become so small as to be practically irrelevant. It's a blip in an otherwise large blue sky. So our sense of minimalism has gone too far. Okay, we've lost the essence of the subject. Our sense of negative space has become too big. It's overwhelmed the subject. Okay, so it's to understand that negative space and the process of minimalism, these things are useful tools and you can employ them. And sometimes when you employ them, you can enhance the mood, the image, the story, the feel of the image. But take it too far and you can ruin it. It's not so where the balance is then becomes part of your judgment, becomes part of your aesthetic. Some people will crop it to a different degree. Some people might crop it that little bit further. Some people might not crop it quite as far because it's what then makes them feel comfortable or what they're trying to express. At this point here, the bird in the sky, actually the sky itself takes on the bigger part of the picture. So much like when we went back to these geese here, in this picture, the geese are no longer the subject of the picture. We've got to zoom into about here before they become the subject of the picture. And the further we zoom out, by the time we get to about here, they're stopping being the subject. The subject is much more about the landscape, about that horizon, about the reflections within the horizon, about the balance between the sky and the water. And the further we move out, the less important they are as part of the subject. Now, they're an accent. They play, if those two weren't there, it would feel just a little bit empty. By having them in there, they start to give it a slight sense of scale, or just they break up the image a little bit. But they're no longer the subject. And so it is with this. Okay, so hopefully that's making a little bit of sense there. So now, one of the interesting things with let's flip back for a moment. Right, so I'll just close that. And one of the things I want to talk about here is the notion of what the background is doing. And part of Susan's question to me, when we were going backwards and forwards about what we might discuss, what could be the topic for August. And she's talking about that notion of negative space. And she said particularly to do with the blurry background. Okay, at what point does it become negative space? We usually think of negative space as empty space, but can it also be a blurred background? Soft focus, leaves perhaps behind a sharp flower. Would it make a difference how blurry the background is considered, or it needs to be in order to be considered negative space? Now that's a really interesting one. So, okay, I'll tell you what we'll do here is okay, so one sec, let me just so I suddenly realise I need to change something here. Right, so let's say we take this photo. Okay. Oh, April says good question. Yes, yes, it is a good question. So if you take something like this, so we've got this is taken back kind of early mid-spring. So willow buds starting to kind of come out, and again down at Carling Walk Loch, same place. But what's happened here is I've got I'm zoomed in with a narrow depth of field, so wide aperture, And what that allows allows for a nice sharp little willow bud here, just starting to sprout out little bits of detail of, bits of fine thread. And it's, quite nice. But the background is out of focus. Now the background is there enough for us to be able to see that it is a background, so we can guess that this is water with a bit of headland behind it. Okay, so it's out of focus, but essentially it becomes negative space. Its negative space is out of focus enough in order for the willow to feel in focus. Okay, it's to draw our eye to it. So the willow here is the subject. The rest of it is the negative space, and because it's out of focus, it doesn't draw our attention. However, depending on where you want to draw your line with the notion of negative space, that background is still contributing to the narrative. It's not just saying that this is an isolated willow bud, it's saying that these willow buds are in the context of a loch and a background on a sunny day. Okay, so what I'll do here is let me show you, we'll do something else. Let's take this flower here, right? So I'll just open this in Photoshop for the moment. Right, so we've got a calendula. And I'm fairly certain it's a calendula. I've got calendula written down onto my file name, so I will have asked my wife, what kind of flower is this? And she would have said calendula. So I'm no botany expert. However, pretty. It's a pretty orange flower, okay? And the sun is behind it and the light is coming through it, and it's a nice little kind of pretty picture. And in the background, what we have is we have other flowers. I think there's probably another calendula over there. Not sure what the yellow bit is. But these these flowers in the background become echoes. Okay? So what we're talking about here is we have our calendula, but we also have, there is a chunk of negative space, this grey negative space over on the left. That's creating that sort of a more room to breathe. But these other out of focus flowers are creating these kind of echoey bits which to help, they've got the orange and the yellow to help reflect the orange and the yellow within the leaves of the flower. Now, what I'm going to do here is if I'm lucky, this did work earlier, or got close to it. If I click select subject, hopefully it's just going to, yes, it has, look at that, rather beautifully, almost. I just need to, it's not quite got the whole of this stem. So I will just come down here and select that. And what we've done here nicely is select the flower. Okay, close enough, right? This isn't going to be an absolutely exact, but it should be enough to give you an idea of what I'm going to do. Now what I can do is I can copy that and paste that onto a separate layer. Okay, so we've now got our calendula on a separate layer. What this allows me to do, I'll duplicate that layer. I'm going to blur the background and watch what happens. Okay, so I go to filter, blur, Gaussian or Gaussian blur, and we can now change the amount I want to blur it. Now 2.5, it's not making 3.4, not making a lot of difference, not making a lot of difference. Once I start getting up on this size photo to 26, 42, we notice the background is blurring more. Okay, and it's getting more. Now we're starting to get to a point whereby it's less obvious. When we're here, it's really obvious that these are flowers in the background. When we get up to here, we're now just getting a sort of loose colour. We're not necessarily colouring the whole. Now it's becoming even more blurred. Now we get up to here, now we get up to here, and it's patches. And at this point, the background is completely negative space. There is no identifiable subject in the background to enhance or detract from the key subject. So the amount of blur we have is affecting how much background we can see. Now, at this point, we still can't see it. We've got echoes of the colours, but we still, so this you would still call negative space, but it's still an enhancement. So there comes this point. At what point where do you draw the line? At what point is the background, in terms of negative space, creating, becoming negative space? Okay. And back here, you would say the black bit's a negative space, but you wouldn't call the right side of it. But as we move up and blur it more, compared to the subject, it then becomes more and more negative space. Okay? So, hopefully then that's starting to give you an idea. So that notion of how blurred it needs to be is kind of to do with, well, how distracted by the background are you? Is the background enhancing the narrative, detracting from the narrative? And that notion of, if it's to be called a negative space, it needs to not, at the very least, not be detracting from the key subject. Okay? So hopefully, yeah, that makes sense. April says so pretty. Marilyn says helpful. Excellent, good. So another couple of things I want to mention here with regard to negative space is the next thing I want to talk about here is that I'm just going to touch on it slightly, is shadow. Okay, so in the likes of this, if we take this photo here, my friend Mark, so there's a lot of negative space in this, and the negative space is the shadow. But if you think about how the shadow defines this face, if this face wasn't lost in shadow, it would have a completely different feel to it. Okay, so shadow itself can become quite a strong way of using negative space. When you've got a negative space like this shadow, the brain fills in the gap. Okay, so it's the fact that we can only see half the face, we can't help but sort of imagine what the other half of the face is. We assume it to be the same, but then it might not be. And in some kind of gothic horror film, there could be half a face missing. In some kind of pirate adventure, there could be a patch over the eye. So depending on where your imagination goes, you might fill in the gap with something else. But just wanted to make note of the fact that negative space doesn't necessarily have to be a blurry background or a foggy background. It can actually be lost in the shadow as well. And then this one, again, if I was to do like I did with the kite and stretch it out, you could make it more minimalistic and have it sort of surrounded by more black. But again, you would get to a point whereby it would just become kind of ridiculous. So you're judging all the time with the photo that you've got, the narrative you want to put across, how much negative space is going to work for that particular image and what you particularly wish to express. Okay, so I hope that's all making sense. Tell you what we'll do, we'll just kind of at that halfway through point. So we'll just a quick reminder then that if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. Another quick little reminder here, I have managed to click a little tick a little box in Buy Me a Coffee, which means that if you are one of these who regularly buys me a coffee or a couple of coffees each month, then there's now a little box you can tick which says monthly. So it will automatically come off once a month. So you don't have to keep worrying about, oh, did I buy Kim a coffee this month or not? And also for those who like to buy me a coffee weekly, because it's a monthly thing, you either need to times it by 4 or do the monthly thing over 4 payments. And then it will automatically keep going. So there's that. But also, if you are wanting to get in contact, you're wanting to send me images for critique, send images for challenges, or anything like that, you can always contact me, kim@kimayres.co.uk. And of course, a wee reminder that we also have our Flickr group and our Facebook group as places where you can put images, ask questions, and kind of be social with other members, other people who sort of turn up. I say members, we're not really members, but social group. Right, okay, so what are we going to do now? So yes, next thing I want to talk about is the notion. So far what we've been talking about in terms of negative space is the space that surrounds the subject. Okay, but the negative space doesn't have to be so much surrounding the subject, it can also be within the subject. So if I do this, for example, then what we have here is we have a spider's web. And the background of this is suitably out of focus such that we can't see what the background is. And right at this moment, I can't remember what it was. It was that colour. It was these sort of purpley pinks. I cannot for the life remember what actually was behind This was sort of on an old rusty fence, and I've not included the fence. But dew-covered web, and the negative space here is what defines the web. You can't see the web unless you can actually see all the gaps between it. Now, at this point, what we've got the colour, though, is adding to it. If we put this into, say, black and white, then there is very light, sort of slightly lighter patches of grey. But really now, a bit like the shadow, it's the absence, it's the negative parts which are absolutely defining the positive. None of these fantastic shapes, none of all these little dewdrops, all these little jewels of light and all these beautiful little circles would be visible or noticeable or have any chance of being really a part of the photo if it wasn't for all the big spaces between the threads. Okay, so the negative space here is an absolutely vital part of the picture. Now, this isn't really minimalism because it's a very complicated photo. If you wanted to go minimalism, you would have to strip it back to its essence. You would have to strip it back to its basics and say, what's the minimum amount I could get away with and still have the essence of the photo? And in that case, what you probably have to do is sort of zoom right in, and you'd have to sort of do something like that, maybe. How far can we get it where you go, okay, that's probably still a web. You can still identify what it is, but there's not a lot in the photo. So a minimalistic approach would either be this, or you would go the other way and you would expand out to have just this little bit of thing into a large expanse of more or less nothingness. Okay. But so this then isn't about minimalism, but this is very, very much about employing negative space within it. Another example here is the dandelion head. Okay, so again, macro shot, got the dandelion clock, very, very narrow depth of field, wide aperture, macro lens on this. And what happens here is only a small part of this is actually in focus. We can see here where the sharp lines are, and then it gets very blurry very quickly. And again, we can move, so other little kind of seed heads that are out of focus, little bits of the base of the seed heads that are sharp, some that are out of focus or in focus, depending on where it is. So just by subtly moving the focal point of the lens, I could be focusing on the front of the dandelion, at the back of the dandelion, and this one's trying to get somewhere in the middle. And what is making this picture is all the gaps between it. But there's an interesting point here, which is, which bit is the negative space? You see, when we go back to the web, it's very clear and obvious that the negative space is the bit that isn't the subject. It's the black bit. We tend to think of it as being the black bit. But in this case, the black bit, the bit we can't see, is that actually the negative space, or is the negative space the white behind it? Let's just show this a little bit more, kind of to try and get across what I'm talking about. April says, yeah, also it's a very abstract shot. Yes. But if we take this idea then of the tree, this winter tree against the orange sky of the sunset background. And this then is very much, well, it's black. And generally speaking, you think of the black part, the bit that we can't make out the detail, as being the negative space. Well, there's far more detail in the sky than there is in the tree. And yet, actually, when you look at this, you would say the subject is the tree. So silhouettes are a kind of an interesting part of the notion of negative space, because in a way, a silhouette is negative space. And yet, when you place it against the background, because your eye gets drawn to the silhouette, it is the background that becomes the negative space. Let's take this idea into something a little bit more obvious. So here's this picture of my friend Alan taking, I'll just move it down a bit here so you can get it. So I'm not blocking Alan's head there. So here then again, we've got this picture and we can see man holding camera, got the camera strap, all the rest of it, but he's in silhouette. So which bit is the negative space? If the photo is about the sun setting over the water, then actually he's the negative space. But at the same time, what you're really drawn to is the fact that you've got the photographer and probably the sun, and then the sky being relatively featureless, just this glorious orange, and again the sea relatively featureless apart from the kind of little line coming down. But certainly the sky is what we consider to be the negative space in this. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's not necessarily obvious, and well, although I wouldn't get too hung up on it. I think if there was a challenge or a competition called negative space, I think you could throw in an image like this quite happily and then let the judge decide which actually counts as a negative space, and I think they'd probably go, that's fine, you could call it either way. So this notion then of negative space isn't always exact. Most of the time it is, but like a lot of these things, you have things which are really obvious, and then you have obviously are, then you have things which are obviously not, and then you have, well, where's the line in the middle? And that line in the middle is going to shift slightly depending on who's looking at it, what mood they're in, what their prior experiences are, what their personal definitions are, how they were taught. All these things will contribute to how they see this idea of where the line draws between that counts as negative space, that doesn't. Okay, most of us have a slightly wobbly, loose line, and that's okay. If you want to, but to score highly in online contests, particularly, you want to make sure that your negative space is very clearly negative space. Don't go too close to that line, because a lot of people will have their definition drawn slightly different to yours, in which case you cross the line and your picture doesn't count. Even though you might think it counts and somebody else might think it counts, there will be a chunk of people who don't think it counts. Okay, so in terms of that, when it comes to competitions, whether it's Camera Club or it's online, what you have to do is always think, if you want to score more highly, who's judging? And on the online competitions like ViewBug and Guru Shots, Photocrowd, that kind of thing, by and large, the people who are judging tend to be less experienced photographers. They're either complete amateurs or amateur plus, okay? And or people who've only just learned that they can turn there's a camera option on their phone and now goes clicking away. The point being is that they haven't yet learned subtlety, they haven't yet necessarily learned different kinds of definitions. And so they will have a more obvious idea of, so if you want to score highly in those kind of competitions, you have to go for a more obvious thing that fits the definition of negative space. If you're then talking to a Camera Club where they maybe have more defined ideas, then it might also depend on who's doing the judging in that particular contest, because you will know people in the Camera Club who will they will draw their line in a slightly different place. Okay, so that's worth keeping in mind. Okay, next thing I want to move on to then is the notion of, again, we're kind of talking about this now. I'm still into this notion of where we're drawing the lines in negative, which bit counts as a negative space. And although I've just sort of talked about the fact that you want to be clear either side, for us and our personal development, I think the fun quite often is in the borderline, where you're kind of push it, because it's where you decide to create that line or refine that line, I think, is where you are growing as a photographer, because you have to justify it. Fine, if you've got something that's very clearly, like the swan in the mist, very clearly use of negative space, nobody's quibbling, okay? But on something where you're going, I'm not sure what counts as this, or, well, okay, sorry, what I meant is you have your swan, clearly negative space, no problem. And then you have something which clearly isn't negative space, it's a busy picture. Nobody's quibbling. But in that middle bit, this is where you have to make a decision. You have to justify it. And by justifying it, it then helps to hone your understanding of photography, which Name on the tin, name on the screen, understanding photography. This is what I'm trying to get. This is what this podcast is all about. So your shift and your understanding, very often you can help refine that by going to the edges. So let me just, the next section I'm going to just move into briefly in terms of which bit counts as a negative space is if we come to something like this, right? Just very briefly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but just you take a picture like this. Now, what we've got is we've got an old, a ruined bit of room, a kind of bit of decayed room, still needs to be done up. In this case, there's a fresh bit of roof being put on up here, but the whole building is yet to be renovated. And there's windows. Now, you can look at this in two ways. You can look at this as the idea of what you're looking at is an unrenovated room that needs to be done up, which happens to have windows with a view out the back side. Or what you might decide to do is you could see this as the views out the window where the room itself is the negative space. Okay? That actually there's two ways of looking at this. And it's a little bit like that duck rabbit. Anybody know, where you've got that shape where if you look at it one way it looks like a duck, and if you look at it another way it looks like a rabbit. Okay, and whichever way you have to be looking at it, you can't quite see it the other way, and then it seems to flip back and forth. And you can kind of debate and argue the point, but the thing is what you're seeing is exactly the same thing. How you're interpreting what you're seeing changes. That's the key crucial point here. And I start to raise this point with this picture here as an example then of how you decide to interpret it, that the view could be the main topic here, and the building is essentially the negative space, the bit that's not so important. Or it could be about the room, and it's what's out the window is less important. Now, depending on which of these decisions you've to come down on, would then affect perhaps how you edit it, what you might do next. If you're wanting to make more focus on the room, then you might actually blur out or fade out or lighten or darken the actual view so that it's not grabbing your attention so much. And what you might do is draw more attention to the peeling plaster work, the grime, the floor, the dirt, that kind of stuff. Alternatively, if you wanted to make more about the view, you would maybe darken down the inside of the room so it becomes slightly more shadowy, more silhouetty, so it doesn't actually grab your attention so much. Let's move on and show you sort of slightly clearer example of this. So here what we have is an interestingly shaped crack in the wall. Okay, so we've got a dry stone wall, dry stone dyke, as it's known around here, and there's a gap, and through that gap we can just about make out a little bit of green. We assume there's a field the other side of the gap in the wall. But primarily then, this photo is about, well, it's about the stones, but it is also about the crack in the wall. But it's the notion of the crack in the wall. So the topic of the narrative of this is the wall, the bits and pieces that make up the wall, the big stones here, the little bits of gravelly stuff there, the little lay down bits here, and the fact that there's a gap in it is showing that it's got that handmade quality to it. Okay, as opposed to cemented brickwork. Now, I've gone over to another crack in the wall here where I can now see through to that field, and I can see the cows in the field, and I can see a bit of a tree in the field, and I can see the cows lying underneath the tree. But these are now being framed by the wall. So picture within a picture, frame within a frame, that idea we were talking about a few months ago. This then is very much where the wall itself is the negative space. The wall itself is the negative part, which is helping to define and frame the image which is within it. Whereas this one, the image is about the wall, and actually what's through the wall, that is the negative space, which is helping to define the actual wall itself. Is this making sense? Please tell me this is making sense. Or if it isn't making sense, please tell me it isn't making sense. Leave a comment, let me know what you're struggling with, let me know what isn't quite making sense, and I'll try and find a better way of explaining it. And if you happen to be watching if you're watching this on recording and you're not watching live, leave a comment as well. And again, let me know whether it's making sense or it's not. Give me examples, all that kind of stuff. And meanwhile, of course, if you haven't done so already, remember to click the like on this video. It really does help the algorithms. All right, okay. Oh, April says yes. Good. I'm glad that at least one of you is understanding. Thanks, April. Right, okay. Another example then. And this is, we really are kind of pushing our notion of negative space here. But let's say here we've got this old railing, okay? It's painted, it's rusty, it's what have you. And it's got a particular shape. It's got this curve here, and then it's got a circle within it. And you can look through the circle and you can see the tree and a bit of garden and what have you through it. Now, this is, it's not an award-winning photo. I wouldn't bother sticking this into any competitions. This, I just wanted, I was just out with my phone last week and I was thinking about what we were talking about today. And so I just grabbed my phone and thought, oh, there's something. I'll take a couple of images just to sort of make a point. And here what's happening is we're looking through the picture. We are looking through the background. And this gate, this fence, this railing is there to help kind of just create a frame around it. But I can just as easily shift the focus onto the frame, onto the railings itself. Now it's all about the shape of the railing. It's about the texture. It's about the peeling paint. It's about the bits of rust and the shape of the railing. And now the background, the tree and the garden is out of focus. Okay, so the background has now become the negative space, the bit that isn't about the subject. Now, it's not negative space in the way that the swan on the loch was negative space, or the gaps between in the spider web is negative space, but it does still count as that is the bit that isn't the subject. Okay, right. So, hope this is all starting to make sense. Now, the next thing I want to move on to, which is really crucial, is the notion of what happens when you have more than one subject. Okay, because then the negative space between those subjects can also define the relationship between the subjects. Okay, so again, quick little phone photo. This, out from my walk on a different day, sun's starting to going down. I look up, there's a telegraph pole with wires coming off it and 3 pigeons sitting on there, 3 amigos. And here what's happening is the negative space is partly defined by these diagonal lines and the pole. So a bit like the spider web, you've got the gaps here. But then we've also got these 3 pigeons. So we've got 3 subjects, but there's a gap between them. And if they were closer together, that would change the feeling, change the mood, change the relationship. Okay. So the gap between images is actually starting to shape the relationship between, the gap between the subjects is shaping the relationship between the subjects. Let's take a look at this one, for example, as well. And in this case, we've got 2 knights on a board. They're both sitting in their separate little squares. And there's a space between them. But there's not a lot of space. And they feel quite close together. Okay. But there's a negative space within these as well. And when you think about there's that other optical illusion where you have 2 faces. You look at it one way and it's 2 faces facing each other. And you look at it another way and it looks like a vase. And you're not noticing it with just an outline of the edge of the neck of the vase. So there's a little bit here whereby we could, let's just show you if I open that with Photoshop. We can draw the negative space. So if I just, let's create a pencil tool here. Let's make that white, slightly bigger. So here, actually, let's do this maybe a bit too big. The negative space between them is this. Okay? So this space here almost could kind of take on a character of its own. And in fact, if you depending on your imagination, perhaps you've got a little man here with a top hat going, yay, arms out. Okay. So But this space then is part of what's defining it. And if there was a larger space between them, then that would change the relationship of the knights and how they're facing off with each other. Now, I'll tell you what. Let's really show you what I mean by this. Let's take this picture. Okay, so this picture, Phil and Annalise, and for those who remember, I was doing a whole cinematic thing last year, I think it was, or possibly even the year before. So here we've got a couple on the beach, and there's a narrow space between them, and that space is part of the story. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to move on to, no, not that one. I'm going to open this picture. Now, what I've done here is I've got a cinematic version of this picture. Let me just close these other ones so they don't get in the way. Close that. Now, what I've done here is I've created them onto a separate layer. So I can remove that layer. Like we can have Phil separately, we can have Annalise separately. And so to demonstrate, we've got this gap between them. Now, if we move Phil and Annalise slightly further apart, it sort of changes the narrative a bit. If we move them further apart, it changes the narrative again. If we put them right over at the edges of the screen, so now this negative space is the entire length of the picture, it's changed the narrative mood again. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Okay. So very much so with these. And you can imagine the same with the knights on the chessboard, that the gap, the negative space between them is actually is defining the relationship of the two subjects. Okay. So each image is shifting. Okay. So, and in fact, I'll tell you what, let's swap those two around for a moment. Like that. That has a different feel where there's no space between them. But just as easily now, we create a negative space where they're facing away from each other. And that now has a completely different feel to it. Okay? So the space between the subjects is absolutely, fundamentally, having an effect on how we read that picture. And that's the space between them. Alternatively, if we come back to here and we go to this one here, where again what we've got is a very strong negative space between them. But what's enhancing that, we've got a very big negative space around them as well. And as we zoom in, as we remove the negative space on the outside, the negative space on the inside becomes much more dominant and much more important. Okay? Until, again, you put them here and this space becomes, it's taking up nearly a third of the entire image. Okay, so the more the space is taking up of the image, the more it's part of the story. So hopefully then, this is all giving you quite a good sense of what negative space is about and how it fundamentally makes a difference on how we read the photo. The space around the subject is having a fundamental effect on how we interpret the subject. Vigi says, what a shot. No, okay, now one last thing I want to show you before I then sum up kind of what we've been talking about and then talk about the next couple of weeks. And don't run away, because I do, or if you do have to run away, come back to listen to this bit, because I really want your input for next week. Okay. But one last thing I want to talk about, the notion of negative space, just to kind of, it's a fun thing and it's slightly less to do with photography, but I've got a friend called Jay, and Jay makes models, the kind of things that just hang from string from the ceiling and then move around in the breeze, right? And he's made some, so let me show you this one. So one of his really popular ones is these geese. So the geese are flying, so we can see up here, and I was helping to take some photos of it. This is the frame that they're hanging from. We can see these tiny little bits of thread. And what happens is the wings are kind of caught and they move up and down with the with the breeze and what have you. And they also kind of rotate as well, and then they're all slightly independently there, so they kind of rotate. The whole thing will swing around, and each of them independently will sort of rotate slightly left or right, and their wings will go up and down. And it's really quite a feat of engineering. Now, I'm going to come on to it in a moment. So here's a sort of slight close-up of what I'm talking about, and give you a sense of how they're built. But what I want to show you also is, as well as doing the geese, one of the things that he did, and he's done some variations of other things like this, is he made a phoenix. Okay, so he's making thin pieces of wood and he's putting them together. And this phoenix here, so what we've got is we've got a bar up here, but we've also got a bar in the rough shape of a phoenix. And then we've got all these little pieces and the gaps in the piece. So all these little pieces are made to look like little flames. Okay? So he's got wood with other darker, redder bits of wood on it, so that these all look like individual flames. But when they're put together in such a way that when they hang off the two pieces here, you're creating a phoenix with the gap, the negative space. The negative space is an absolutely crucial part of the mobile. Okay? So if we move up a little bit closer, so we're shot against the white background here, we can see then these gaps that are taking part. Even the head here with the eye, there's these spaces. The negative space is a crucial, and look at the beak, the way that comes out. The negative space is a crucial part of the way that the photo, the way that the model, the mobile is built. Now, I will say when it came to trying to photograph this, that because of all the gap, it made it particularly difficult. The easiest way to photograph it was to essentially have an all-white background, lights hitting the white sheet so that you can see through it. But it was quite difficult. But we did have one bit of fun with it, where we created a smoky environment. We thought phoenix, fire, smoke. So we created a smoky environment, lights coming through the smoke, and then all this smoke, while the smoke is quite textured, it kind of blends and sort of blurs and becomes the negative space through which we can then see, the gaps, the negative space, but we can still make out the phoenix itself. Okay, so here you can see that ridged board that's on it. The little marks here are the shadows because we've got it lit from underneath as well as lit from over on the side. Okay, so the light coming through the smoke was one of those things, but we are using the smoke as the negative space. And that the main thing that I wanted to talk about here, just to point out, is the fact that just how negative space can be manipulated. He's done some amazing things as well, where he's created fish which seem to move, which also have these kind of gaps. He's even got a tiger. But the phoenix I've shown you because that was one I particularly helped him with the photographing for. Okay, so hopefully that's given you some ideas. So to kind of summarise this notion of negative space, you can call the negative space the bit which isn't the main subject. Okay, so we've got the subject and then we've got the space around it. However, that negative space, if it's too busy, might be contributing to the subject itself. So we've got the plant against the lock, or we've got the goose against the lock, or something like that, but we can see the lock, and the lock is quite clear. The lock is part of the story. But when the lock is sort of blurred out, or there's fog there, it stops grabbing our attention so much. It's only just a little hint of something to help enhance the key subject, which might be the swan or the plant or the goose or whatever on it. Okay? So the negative space is the bit which is not the key subject, but it can also be a bit which is essentially where our eye doesn't get drawn to. So the negative space is the bit which isn't interfering with our idea of what the subject is. But then sometimes that notion of the negative space, like if we're talking about silhouettes and shadows, the silhouette itself can be the subject, even though there's a whole load of negative space within it. Then there's that notion of where you're focusing on, like the idea of the duck rabbit, or the window and the building, or the gap in the wall. Is it about the gap? Is it about the wall? Is it about the window? Is it about the room? And how you decide to interpret which is the most important part of that picture will then affect how you decide to edit it to enhance whether it's the windows or it's the wall or it's the gap or whatever. Okay, so negative space is an incredibly crucial part of our toolbox, our understanding of how we interpret what it is we're seeing in front of us. When you've got more than one subject, so we've got the chess pieces, we've got the pigeons, we've got the couple nearly kissing on the beach or girl sticking her tongue out at the bloke, then what happens is the gap, the negative space, the space between the subjects fundamentally affects how we interpret what we're seeing. Okay, so negative space isn't just an afterthought, shouldn't just be an afterthought. It's a crucial part of almost every photo. There's some form of negative space within it, which is helping us to define the image. Not all photos, some photos are designed to be busy at every point that you look. But mostly, there tends to be a key subject or subjects. And then what we're trying to do is, how are these subjects defined? And if these subjects have a gap between them, then that's affecting the relationship between them. If there is no other subject, but there's just the subject itself, maybe there's gaps within it, or maybe there's a space around it. And then if that space around it can be quite large and very uninterfering, we can also move into the notion of minimalism as well. So I'm hoping that that's all made sense for you. Thank you for sticking with me for this far. Okay, a couple of comments. Oh, April says, very creative. He has to be a lot of work. Yes, it's a huge amount of work that Jay puts into his mobiles. Vici says, creative, I wish to see a video of the Phoenix. Kudos to him and kudos to you for capturing the essence of fire and smoke. Phoenix rising from the ashes. Right, okay, so thank you to everybody for turning up and listening and sticking with me for this. So before you go running away, quick couple of things. So having talked all about this about the negative space, now I'm setting the negative space challenge. So for 2 weeks' time, I want you to come up with a picture to enter for the negative space photo challenge. Okay, and in 2 weeks, we'll go through all the photos, see how everybody has interpreted the brief. And I know what will happen is each one of you will come up with a different way of interpreting it. And that's brilliant. So when we go through the photos, it will be fun to see how everybody has interpreted it and to give each other ideas. Okay, that's always the great thing about these challenges, is it's not just about whether your picture works in its own right, but it gives other people who are watching these podcasts ideas of how they might approach the subject as well. So be aware of the challenge, get ready for the challenge. Don't go running off just yet. Now, the other thing, very crucial now, please don't run away just yet, or if you have to, come back and watch this bit, is next week. Next week, I'm trying something brand new for these podcasts. So 5 and a bit years doing these podcasts, one of the things I want to do, and this again came out of a suggestion from Susan, which was about the idea of having a discussion. Okay. And what she wanted to know was this notion of, should we kind of specialize in what we photograph? Okay, should we go niche? And a lot of photography advice will say, take a subject, maybe the subject that interests you the most, and keep doing it and become a master of that subject. However, there's another school of thought which says that that can restrict you and that you should sometimes push yourself out of your comfort zone and you should be photographing things which aren't your speciality. Should you actually be spreading yourself wider? Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can interpret this, a whole bunch of different questions that come out of it. And what I would like is your input. So later today or tomorrow, where should we go? In the Facebook group and the Flickr group, I'm going to set up something about this. Certainly in the Flickr group, try and make sure you can go to there. I'm going to set up a little discussion thread. Okay, and what I would really like is for you to put in your thoughts and ideas about, do you go niche or not? Should you be specialist? Should you be generalist? Should you stick to what you know? Should you push yourself out of your comfort zone? Examples maybe where you tried doing one or the other. maybe problems that you've had to overcome, maybe problems that you found insurmountable, any interesting little anecdotes. And if you can really kind of put your information into this, then that would be really great, because what I would like to do next week then is to have a kind of discussion. If people have sent me stuff in, then I can start reading out some of these ideas, discuss these ideas, and then likewise in the live chat you can also join in and put in your thoughts and about it as well. So this discussion then, to niche or not niche, to specialize or generalize, to stick with what you know, to push yourself outside your comfort zone, this is the area that we want to be talking about. So I really want to know, and like I say, so I'll put something into the Flickr group. You'll also have the chance, for, if you're on Facebook, put it into the Facebook group, or email me if you've got a great long essay you want to write, if there's ideas, things you want to talk about, even if you've got pictures which kind of illustrate something, then you can email me, kim@kimayres.co.uk. So that's really exciting. And if that works, then that opens up the idea for discussions on other topics as well. So it's not just I talk about a topic and then set a challenge, or you send me images and I give you feedback, that there are these ideas of concepts of what we do with our photography. And I think this idea of discussions could be really good. So we're going to try that out next week. But it's only going to work if I get your input. A discussion with myself is just me talking to myself. Okay. Right, okay. So Fiji says quite eager for the challenge, and April says, okay, sounds good. Excellent. Right. So that brings us to our conclusion, I think. So thank you to each of you for leaving your comments, letting me know you're here, little bits of feedback, all the rest of it. Each of you who's turned up and written to me live gets your 5 smug points. Anybody who contributes to the discussion for next week, I'll give you 10 smug points as well. So another way of making sure that you're rewarded for your engagement. So if you take part, if you send me something in advance, you'll get 10 smug points for this discussion. I think that's pretty much about it. Remember to click like on the video if you've liked it, all that kind of stuff. And look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.